Hi everybody, Steve Farmer here, once again bringing you continuing coverage for the Arizona Scorpions for the 2012 U.S. Chess League. As many of you will know, especially if you've been following my videos, Arizona has managed to make it into the quarterfinals, and this week they're pairing up against St. Louis. As a matter of fact, these teams played a few weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and on each and every board the same players are paired against each other again, and Arizona won that match by the narrowest of margins. But here they must win it again, because St. Louis has the draw odds. So if it's a 2-2 tie at the end of the match here, St. Louis moves on. Now, in the other matchup of the quarterfinals, we have the Dallas Destiny going up against the Seattle Sluggers. Dallas was in the number 1 slot, Seattle was in the number 4, Arizona was in number 3, and St. Louis was in the number 2 slot. So the top 2 teams had the advantage of tie breaks on drawn matches. They would advance. The matchup between Arizona and St. Louis is the same identical lineup they had a couple weeks ago. I believe it was October 29th when they matched up last time, except for the colors are reversed on each and every board. In this one we see Mackenzie Molnar having white against Grandmaster Diamant. And last time they played, Mac had the black pieces, and he was able to draw that game. For the sake of building the excitement of the match play as it was unfolding, I usually like to swap the boards, go between board 1 and board 4, board 3, like that. But it gets a little confusing. So I'm just going to do one game at a time, but I will mention in the progress of the game what was happening on the other boards, so that you can look at the other boards later on and recall why the players in this certain game that you are looking at did what they did. Now, there's a little mouse out there named Mark that informs me that Mac was not feeling well for this game, as well as for the last game he played. Remember that Evans Gambit, that wild game? He wasn't feeling good for that, so he still has a leftover bug from that, and he's trying to recuperate. So Mac starts out with E4 here, and C5. Okay, Diamant does not want to have anything to do with his Evans Gambits or any other trickery like that. Knight F3, Knight C6, D4, CD4, Knight takes D4, and G6. The dreaded super hyper speedy accelerated dragon. Now, last time they met on October 29th, Diamant had white and they got into a stodgy positional game. But here, Diamant seems to want to head for something a bit more spicy. But if you've watched my videos, not just of the Scorpions, but of other videos, whenever I face the accelerated dragon, even though I'm a very tactically oriented player, I still prefer the move that Mac played here too. He played C4. This may have come as a surprise to Diamant. Hell, it may have come as a surprise to Mac as well. Why did I play C4? But to me, it's no surprise at all. I think that this is just simply the best way to handle the accelerated dragon. You lock out the possibility of playing D5, the freeing move in the dragon. Mac is also a tactically gifted player, but even he can see the merits behind playing the Mackenzie bind. I mean, the Maroxy bind. Okay, so play continued with Knight F6, Knight C3, D6, Bishop to E2, Knight takes knight, queen takes knight, bishop to G7, bishop to E3, castles, queen to D2, and A5. If we take a quick step back, there are many options here. A5 is pretty much the new way to handle the Maroxy bind, and it's becoming quite popular. But to me, I still think that trying to go for the typical breaks of B5 or F5 or even D5, if given the opportunity, is still the way to go for black. But still, this is getting a lot of momentum in top level play with A5. Now, I would normally handle this with castling. This is not what Mac played. And then A4, F3, Queen A5, Rook AC1. Okay, well, we'll get to something like this, but hold your horses. After the move A5, Mac plays Rook to C1, A4, and now he plays Rook to C2. A little bit unorthodox to me, but okay. Queen A5 and F3. Well, this is very similar to what we looked at, except for in the line we just looked at, white was castled and the rook was on c1. Is there any merit to the rook being on c2? Well, yes, there is some merit to it. If white ever plays b3 or b4 in some cases, and black takes on b3, then white's going to have a built-in lateral defense of the second rank. So that could be an offsetting factor for any advantage that black would gain by having the open file. So it's an interesting concept. Now, I don't know a whole lot about this particular line. I know just enough to get me into some trouble, but that's the way I handle openings. Bishop to e6 seems like a logical move here. Diamant didn't play that. He played bishop to d7. Now Mac castled, and rook fc8. Now this apparently is a novelty, so let's take a step back, and we can look at the game between Judith Polgar and Mamedov from China 2011, where bishop c6 was played. Now that makes sense because the bishop came to d7 instead of e6, so why not plop the bishop down on a nice diagonal? And after rook fc1, knight to d7, knight to d5, bishop takes queen, rook takes, c takes d5. I like white's position. Indeed, Judah went on to win in 48 moves. You know, white's got a tiny edge here, not much more, but he does, or she does, have the bishop pair. Now white has a solid pawn structure. Black's a little bit awkward with his pawns on the queen side. White's got the open file and the bishop pair. She managed to win this game after 48 moves. Back in our game though, rook fc8 was played, and that's a novelty. Rook fc1, bishop to e6. Okay, black spent the tempo on getting the bishop here, but it's not a big deal. It's pretty much a closed, it's officially a semi-open position, but it's really a closed nature type feel to it. White doesn't have the typical queenside play that he'd like to have in the dragon, and so black is just trying to put his pieces on the best squares possible. Bishop f1 and knight to d7. Now, the pawn on c4 is under some pressure, but Mac finds a nice way to tactically hang on to that pawn instead of going through some contortions. You know, queen to d3 is just going to allow the knight to come to e5 and pick up the pawn. And how else do you save it? Well, Mac found queen to f2, which is pretty nice. And now Diamant plays queen to b4, which is the correct move. Now, if you are wondering why you cannot take that pawn, well, remember the idea knight to d5? Well, it comes in here as well, because the bishop on c4 is hanging, and if the bishop moves, then the rook on c8 is hanging. This is just losing for black. So, always got to look out for that little tricky move, knight to d5, in these dragon variations. Like I said, queen to b4 was played. Now knight to b5, queen to a5, rook to b1, queen to d8. Now black's just expanded his position as far as he can. He can't make any other progress unless white leaves him some opening. Here he doesn't even have logical pushes like f5 or something like that. I don't believe f5 would be a good move here. So he's stuck in this a5 variation to dependence on whatever white plays. Mac puts the knight on d4. Now knight c5. You know, black's got a good position. It's solid. And there's really not much white can do. Probably white has a little tiny edge, but not much. b4 was played. Now, David Prost was watching this. Actually, David was commentating on chess.com, and he didn't like any of these b-pawn breaks, b3 or b4. But I've seen similar positions several times. Maybe a few more moves deeper into the line, but b4 gets played quite often. Now, Diamant trades, takes, bishop to d7. All right, another move with the bishop, but it's not a big deal. b4, gaining a little more queenside space. Knight to e6. Knight takes. Another move by the bishop. Now, I thought the bishop to d4 was a slightly better shot than what Mac played here, but positions level. What are you going to do? Mac played c5, and after dc5, b takes c5, queen to c7, bishop c4, bishop takes, rook to a1. Whole lot of trading going on here. Rook takes, rook to c1, and bishop to g7. The players agreed to a draw here, and it's really rather pointless to play on. It is really, really level here. Neither side can really make any advantageous breaks or anything. So you have a status quo that's going to last for a long time. And these players are such caliber that neither side's going to mess up. So it's a draw. It's a logical outcome. And this is pretty much sticking to Arizona's game plan. To draw on this board, maybe get draws on 2 and 3, and hope that DPro can pick up another win on board 4 against Hendrickson, which he was able to do 2 weeks ago when the teams met. I hope that Mac gets well soon. I hate to see people playing when they have a fever. Playing with a fever in chess, or playing when you're sick in chess, is really, really rough. Really rough. Now, I used to play basketball, and I've played with the fevers, having the cold, sniffles. I could play basketball while I was still sick. I'd feel like crap the next day. But chess, man, one little slip up anywhere during the game, one little moment of lack of concentration could spell doom. So that Mac got a draw out of this game, even with the white pieces, I think is a moral victory, more or less. I hope you get better, Mac, and hopefully you have a cute blonde neighbor somewhere that will bring you some chicken and stars and sing Soft Kitty to you. Alright, let's jump over to board 4, what we would consider the anchor leg of the team for tonight's matchup, and see what happens there. Here we have 2 national masters, Hendrickson for St. Louis playing white at the top, and DPro Chakraborty playing black at the bottom. Play started out with e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, and now I think that black should continue with playing the Pirates or something like that, but he didn't. He played e5. I personally don't like this choice. It allows white the opportunity to get queens off the board and prevent black from castling. Now, DPro moved very quickly throughout the opening of this game. So this tells me that there was some home cooking going on in this, and that they knew that Hendrickson would go down this line. The reason that DPro was willing to go through this forfeiture of castling is he wanted to get to an endgame, because he outplayed Hendrickson a couple weeks ago with the white pieces. He won a nice endgame. So he was hoping to repeat that. He was hoping to get another endgame where he could outplay his opponent. This is tantamount to taking your glove off and slapping an adversary and challenging him to a duel. And Hendrickson took him up on it. Takes, queen takes. King takes. Black can no longer castle. Bishop c4, develop with a tempo, hitting f7. King to e8, knight f3, and now bishop to d6. It was possible to play knight c6 as well. You're not really getting into trouble on this, because if knight to g5, you can play bishop to b4. He now needs to protect that knight. I don't think he can get away with bishop takes f7 because of king e7. Now, of course, he could drop the bishop away, but black will get compensation by taking on c3, playing the pawn to h6, kicking the knight away from the defensive e4, and he'll get the pawn back. So bishop d2, bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, h6. And white's going to lose a piece. And he does not get enough compensation, because after knight f3, king takes, he can play knight takes, bishop takes, but rook to e8 is going to get one of the 2 pawns back. And we can check king f6, and white's lost the piece for 1 pawn. Not good. So back here, he could play bishop to d2, and then h6, knight f3, and things are pretty level here. DPro moved quickly again, and played bishop to d6, bishop to g5, knight bd7, castles long, h6, bishop h4, a6. I think that the position is actually pretty level here. White's opening advantage is very, very slim. But, you know, when you challenge your opponent like this, you got to expect some payback. a4 was played. Now b6 and rook he1 was played. Let's take a step back. There was a curious game between Etienne Bacrot and Victor Bologan from Odessa 2007, which continued with knight to d5. Now, I think bishop b7 is probably the best move here, but Bologan played g5, and after knight takes f6, knight takes f6, bishop to g3. Now, he should play bishop to g4 with, you know, decent chances in the opening, but he played knight takes e4, which is a mistake. Now, bishop takes e5. Now, he should fess up here and play f6. After bishop takes d6, knight takes, bishop to d5, rook to b8. White's got a clear advantage, but the material's equal. But positionally, White's doing a lot better here. In the game, though, Bologan played bishop takes e5. And after knight takes e5, he should try bishop to e6. It's an ugly looking move, but it's the only one that would keep him in the game. White would be better, of course, but after knight takes f2, this is just poorly calculated on Bologan's part. Knight takes f7. Now, remember, black can't castle. I don't know that that would do him any good anyhow. Knight takes d1, knight takes h8, and black is just toast here. He plays bishop to g4, and now white should continue with knight to g6 check, but he doesn't. He played h3. And now bishop to h5 was a horrible move. After white's inaccurate h3, he could have tried king to d7, hitting the knight. Knight tries to run. We hit it again. Knight to e5 check. Now we can come here and we're hitting the knight on e5. So the knight on d1 never gets to be taken without black taking something back. But here, after h3 and Bologan's wonderful move, bishop to h5, white can play g4. And now two pieces are hit simultaneously, and you can't defend both of them. Yeah, Bacrot was back on the winning path and ended up winning the game in 26 moves. Another 6 moves from here. But back in our game, after b6 was played, Hendrickson played rook he1, which seems logical. Bishop b7, bishop takes knight, knight takes bishop, knight to d5. Now I think that Dipro should have traded here. He didn't. He played knight to d7. Let's take a step back. In the game of Jovanovic versus Aschenbrenner from Croatia 2011, knight takes d5 was played. And then bishop takes, rook takes, and now f6. But come on, this cannot be a position that you would love as black if you're expecting to outplay your opponent in the endgame. True, you have the bishop versus knight imbalance, but that's really a bad bishop versus a so-so knight. And white's got pretty good control of the d file, so any exchanges that happen there are not going to be advantageous to black. Now, black ended up pressing too hard and lost the game, though this position is pretty level. Back in our game, knight to d7 was played. Hendrickson played knight c3. Now Dipro plays rook to d8. But going back, maybe he should have tried knight f6. Just testing the waters to see if white would play knight to d5 again, and then he'd go knight to d7. The worst, you would gain a whole minute on the clock. You would also gauge white's true feeling about the position. If he thought it was a draw, he would go back to c3 and see if you'd repeat with knight f6, going for the draw. Now, of course, black doesn't want to go for the draw here. That's not Arizona's game plan. But I think that Hendrickson probably would have accepted a draw had Dipro offered the repetition. But Dipro played rook to d8 right away, instead of trying to gain a little time on the clock. Bishop d5 was played, bishop to c8. Alright, so Dipro's got his queen rook into the game before blocking it in with the bishop to c8 move. But as we can see, he is very cramped, and his inability to castle is really starting to be felt. He is really cramped. Knight to d2 was played, and now f6 I think would be stodgy and give black level play, but he played bishop to b4, rook to e3, and now knight f6 I think was a slight inaccuracy. Let's take a step back. Knight to b8. Now black is in really tight confines, so I think he should try and fight back for control of the light squares on the queen side. For example, if he plays rook to f3 hitting that pawn, we can just play f6. Things look pretty level. If he goes bishop to b3 so as not to be kicked by c6, we still play c6 anyhow to try and gain some control of the light squares on the queen side and in the center. I think this is a pretty level position as well. In the game though, DePro played knight f6, now knight c4. White's got a lot more space, black is still cramped. Bishop c5, rook e to d3, bishop to d4. And here Hendrickson played knight to e2. Let's take a step back. You know me, I'm a tactically minded player. I thought f4 was a much more feisty move. Trying to undermine the bishop on d4 is the obvious thing. So bishop takes on c3, rook takes ef4, now knight to e5. Yeah, this just seemed like white got plenty of compensation out of this line. And if knight takes d5, e takes d5, and the c6 square is a juicy square for the knight, and the pawn on c7 is hit. So there's really only one move black can play here, and that is c5. And now I think that just simply rook to e1, and white seems to have a nice initiative here. Definitely compensation for the pawn, and he's probably going to be able to win the pawn back with relative ease. But in the game, Hendrickson played knight to e2, and now it would be a horrible mistake, go pawn grabbing. DePro played knight takes d5, which is the best move. But let's go look at the pawn grabber's idea. Bishop takes on f2, bishop takes f7, it's check, king takes, knight takes e5 with check, and now if king to e7, knight to c6, check is winning for white. And if king to e6 to hit the knight, then rook takes d8, rook takes, and then the other rook takes. So this is winning for white. Yeah, after knight takes e5 check, king can't go back because the rook takes d8. So king e6 is the only move, or king e7. So yeah, you do not want to grab the pawn on f2. You got to get rid of that bishop. And that was DePro's idea with the whole bishop to b4 to c5 to d4 maneuver. And now Hendrickson plays the correct move, plays e takes d5. Other captures just don't work out. Now DePro grabs a pawn, and knight takes e5. And so we're at a bit of a paradox for a new player in the chess league. I don't know how many team events he's played on, but it's a lot of pressure to play on a team. You know, you feel like, I beat this guy pretty handily 2 weeks ago. I never felt in danger 2 weeks ago. I got into an endgame that I won pretty easily 2 weeks ago. I think that I can win this game, guys, so let me press on to try and win the game. Well, you got to play what's on the board. And I think, unfortunately for DePro, he tried too hard in this game. I think that he had to realize that he had to make some positional concessions and try and maintain just a slightly inferior game rather than press too hard and end up in a losing game. So here he played bishop to h4. Now, I think that f6 was a better idea. And after knight to c6, rook to d7, rook to f3, bishop to c5, rook to e1, bishop to d6, knight e d4, it's checked, and king to f7. I think that white's better, but not by a huge margin. I think that black can work his way out of this. Plus, black does have the bishop pair. You know, so this gives the possibility that many moves down the road, black could climb into a slightly better position and then maybe parlay that into a winning position. But, you know, that's the more stodgy line is with f6. Got to find some safety for the king and get your king-rook into the game. DePro played bishop to h4. And now d6 is played. At first, when I saw this, I thought it was a good move. But when I got to studying it later on, I started to have my doubts. I think that rook to f1 straight off is a better idea, and then bishop f6, knight c6, and rook to d7. Now the difference between this and the line we just looked at with f6, black is still all tied up. Because the bishop's on f6 and not the pawn, there's no f7 square for the king to go to get the king rook into the game. So you start to see some of the problems black is having, even in this line. But this rook f1 idea is a lot better than the path he chose with d6. Because after this, black can trade. And when you're cramped, what do you want to do? You want to trade. Rook takes, pawn takes, rook takes d6. And now d-pro played bishop f2. Let's take a step back. I thought he had a better way of holding things together. And that's first to start out with hitting the knight. Now, white can counter that by hitting the bishop on c8. And now bishop to e6. Now the knight's still under pressure, so he drops back. And now bishop to d8. Okay, it's a bit groveling to bring the bishop back, but black's got the bishop pair. The pawns are equal. You have a nice imbalance of 2 versus 3 on both sides of the board, each side having a majority. But black has the bishop pair and pawns on both sides of the board. Now he'll be able to play king to e7, rook to e8, king to f6 or f8. The rook's into the game. The pawns are defended on the queen side. Yeah, this is an equal game with chances for both sides. In the game, though, d-pro played bishop to f2, knight c3, and again, here I think f6 is an idea. You find safety for the king. You got to get that rook into the game somehow. But he played king to e7, with the idea of getting rook into the game, but rook to d2. Okay, d-pro is chewing up the clock here. In the beginning of the game, he moved rather quickly. But like I said, he started chewing up the clock. And what do I always say about a long think in the US Chess League? Yes, long think equals bad move. He played bishop c5. Let's take a step back. Bishop to g1 was the only move. And after h3, bishop to e6, knight c6 check, king f6. I think that black's got an equal game here with chances further down the road to try and press for the win. But at least it's an equal position. In the game after bishop c5, Hendrickson has a very nice retort, and he found it with no problem. He played b4. Okay. Quite a bit of problem for black in this position here. There's all sorts of knight forks that are around. Now here, if bishop to g1, this is not what was played. Knight to f3. And now that bishop has nowhere to go but to e3. And then knight to d5 check forks the bishop and the king. Similarly, if bishop to b4, you have knight to d5 check, forking in a different way. If king to f6, this is what I thought was his only shot. We have knight to d7 with check. Bishop takes d7. B takes c5 because the bishop's still hit on d7. Bishop c8 and cb6. And even this looks like a pretty easy win for white. And lastly, there's bishop to d6 hitting the knight. But then you have rook takes, king takes, knight takes f7, and it's forking the king and the rook. Winning for white. A piece and a pawn up. So, fork me. What does he do here? Well, he decided to try bishop to e3. But this does not prove to be enough. After knight to d5, forking the king and bishop, king to e6, attacking the knight on e5. He takes, but now there's knight to c4, king moves, and knight takes b6. And this is just quite simply a winning endgame for white. The tables from 2 weeks ago has been turned. Bishop e6, c4, rook b8, c5, rook b7, king b2. I mean, these moves need no explanation. King e3, rook's attack, so defend it. g5, b5, h5, rook to d6, h4, c6, rook to c7. Oh, I guess one quick note. You can't take the knight because of the counter sacrifice here. And fe6 and c7. The rook can't get to c6 or b8 to stop the pawn from promoting. White wins. So he played rook to c7 here. Rook takes e6 check, just as I showed you a moment ago. fe6, knight c4 is check, king to b6, and now b6. And dPro resigned because if he goes here, then we have a similar thing where the rook can't get back to stop the promotion, and the behind the pawn square is guarded. Alright, so what a turn of events. dPro, who was expected to be the anchor for Arizona in this match, loses this game. So these were the first two games to finish. Out of these two games, Arizona only has 1/2 point. Okay? What does that mean? Well, on boards 2 and 3, we have Canapan and Brigadzia, who are playing for St. Louis, who have had tremendous seasons this year. And we have Altunian and Mohandesi going up against them. So we have two very strong performing young players going up against two veterans. It's going to come down to those two boards. Now Arizona is going to have to get 2 points out of those two games. They need to win them both. If they have a win and a draw on those two boards for Arizona, it's a tied match. St. Louis advances. Alright, so let's move on to the next game. So after the dPro debacle on board 4, I'm sure that Arizona was already starting to formulate plans for the 2013 season. Why? Priyadharshan Kanapan, well, this guy's been on a tear. He scored 8.5 out of 10 season games. That is a phenomenal 77% scoring ratio. And he established a performance rating this year of 2701. Lev Altunian, playing black here, was one of only 2 people this year to hold him to a draw. But okay, we're starting out this game, and all games just started out. So Lev didn't know whether he needed a draw or a win on this game, at least not at this point. Priya starts out with knight f3, knight f6, e3, g6, and b4. To me, this is psychological mistake number 1. Trying to get Lev Altunian out of book is really pointless to me. Now, there's nothing wrong with this opening for white. I have a friend up in Phoenix that plays this sort of stuff all the time. And there's nothing wrong with it. White gains some control of the queen side. It makes for an interesting game. But if it's used as a psychological ploy, it's an epic fail. Why? Well, I have seen Lev play what I would consider some absolute garbage moves. Okay, Lev, don't take offense. Lev is a couple classes above me. I mean, he has purpose behind every move he plays, even what I would consider the garbage moves. But since he's such higher class player than I am, I mean, if I was as strong as he was, he'd be doing videos of me because I'm more flashy in my play and better looking. But he's there, I'm here. Now, he has logic behind his chess. He loves to just get into a chess game and play it. Opening theory, yeah, he knows it pretty well. But when you throw something like this at him, and he knows that you're not 100% booked on it, he's going to be comfortable sharing the time on the clock with you and figuring things out with you. I don't think this is a successful idea against somebody like Lev. Actually, I would not recommend surprise openings to against any veteran at all. I get people trying to play the Elephant Gambit against me or the Latvian. People trying to play that stuff. They don't realize that I've probably faced it more than they've played it. And since they're bad defenses, I know what to do against them. Like somebody playing the fried liver against me, I'll play the Ulvestead against it. Now, Mackenzie Molnar is going to be able to beat me with that, probably 90% of the time. But you flip that around to people of my rating and lower, I'm going to be on the other side of that table. I'm going to be the one with the 90% score. As a matter of fact, I am. I look at my record against trashy openings, and I'm very good against them. But, that's because I'm a veteran, and a lot of these guys that play this stuff are, they're coffee house players, or, no offense to coffee house players, but we're talking tournament chess. You play that in a tournament game, you're in for trouble. Now, like I said, getting back to the merits of this opening as a opening, it's fine. Nothing wrong with it. But if he was using it for a psychological ploy, as I said, epic fail. Lev plays bishop to g7, bishop to b2, castles, c4, d6, King's Indian style setup, d3, c5, a3, b6, very simple logical chess, bishop e2, bishop b7, castles, knight to c6. Okay, now, this is actually a novelty here. It's always a question on where to put the knights. And one of the first persons that I got a real clear explanation on this from was Lev. It's about 4 or 5 years ago. We were analyzing some games after a tournament, and he was explaining to one of the players there why you want to put your knight on the third rank rather than the second rank, for what reasons. If you are able to wait for your opponent to put his knights out, it is a lot easier for you to determine exactly where the knights belong. Now, in another game, knight bd7 was played. So this is playable too. And this is from Yatsenko versus Nepomniachtchi from Kazan, 2003. After queen b3, e6, rook d1, queen e7, knight c3, rook a c8, d4, cd4, knight takes d4, a6. We have a very typical type game for this opening. And black went on to win this in 34 moves, but that's not due to the opening. That was further inaccuracy. But I do like Lev's idea knight c6. Huge difference where the knight goes at this point? Not really, but going by principles, which Lev is very well versed in, principles, knight c6 just makes more sense to me. Pre-played queen to b3, e6, knight c3. The game's just pretty level here. Queen to e7, rook f d1, rook f to d8, rook a c1, rook a b8. Simple idea. It may not make a lot of sense to a lot of people when they look at this, but Lev's got his rook on the same file as the enemy queen. You'd like to do that whenever you can. But you go, wait, Steve, that file is not open. Well, here's another thing that comes to bear on this position. It's going to be the talk about tension and trades. And we'll get into that in a moment. But we'll see that the rook here on b8 has a useful purpose if white decides to trade b takes c5. Black can play b takes c5 himself. And he's ready to play bishop a6, attacking the queen. So knight to d2 was played here. d4 is probably a good alternative. But knight to d2 and knight to e8. Now Lev plays a strategy of playing things close to the vest, and a lot of the players in team play do this. You always want to keep an equal position, maybe a slightly better position if you can, but at least be in the game if you need to be called on to do something with your position. So that's what the players are doing here. Now me, in an individual encounter, would probably play d5. And then we might see something like b5, knight a5, queen c2, d4, ed4, cd4, knight a2, and e5. Now, to be honest, I think I would prefer black here, but I realize that the position's probably just equal. But I like black. He's got a little more space. He's got some nice squares he can aim after, like c5. The bishops are not dead. Now, black's got some hope in this position. But, that being said, there is nothing wrong with Lev's move, knight to e8. Now bishop f3, and now f5. This is one of those garbage moves that I told you about. It's not a bad move, don't get me wrong, but it's what I would not play. Again, I would have played d5. Alright, this is just my aggressive nature. And if cd5 we don't take back right away, we play knight to e5. Now, If de6, we flick in, knight takes d3, we're hitting the rook and hitting the bishop on b2, which is a good thing. Now, e takes f7 would be an error because the queen takes f7, the queen takes, king takes. Now he can protect the bishop. We takes. But at the end of this, bazinga, white's losing. So ef7 check looks appealing, but it doesn't work. Rook to b1 is the best idea, and now we can take the bishop on f3. Take the pawn with the queen. Of course, this is going to fracture your pawns a bit, but I think black's got a good position here. It's ready to just dominate the diagonal and has equal control of the d-file, and the knight can swing around to b5 or d5 later on. Black's got good things going for his position here, even though the pawns are fractured. So after d5, cd5, knight e5, if he plays bishop e2 to preserve that bishop in this line, then we go ed5, d4, cd4, ed4, knight to c6, and this position is at least equal. I think black's got play, white's got play. But let's go back to our game where Lev played f5. One thing I know about Lev is he likes to keep the tension in the position as long as possible, and this is what skilled players do. Skilled players will maintain the tension as long as possible, as long as it's not detrimental to their positions. Less skilled players try and resolve the tension, oftentimes, too quickly. Knight f1 was played, and now g5. Okay, you want to hear me call this a garbage move? Alright, it's a garbage move, but it's a good move. Again, my preference would have run along the lines of d5, trying to resolve tension. cd5 and knight e5 once again. And now bad here is de6, knight takes f3, gf3, bishop takes f3. Black's doing pretty well here. So bishop to e2 instead, ed5 and knight a4. Positions truthfully about level. But black's got a little bit of spatial advantage. No, I don't know. I think I would prefer black, but I think white's playable too. But let's go to Lev's move here in the game of g5. Yeah, Lev here, after this move, is in his natural habitat. He plays both the board and the player, not one or the other. That's a very smart player in my opinion. Now, this move may not technically be the most accurate, but it is surely one that will make your opponent spend a little extra time in a game that has a short time control, trying to figure out what to do here. Alright, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6. Now black has the bishop pair, and d4 comes in. Now, David Pruiss, who is covering the quarterfinals for chess.com, he brought up a very nice, clear way of explaining resolving the tension. And I'd like to relay that to you as well. I often forget to explain this to students. It's just something that I look at naturally. But people that are learning the game really need to learn this lesson about tension. Tension. Okay, what is tension? It means there are various captures or checks, things like that are possible in a position. How do you deal with them? Most players, most inexperienced players, will try and resolve them too quickly. You know, it's a lot of work to make a move, not making a capture. Say it's black's move here. Does he capture d4? Does he capture b4? Does he play d5? What does he do here? Play b5 maybe. There's some good moves to consider. But there's another way to do it. Look at the captures that are possible. If black captures one way or the other, is it of any advantage to him? What I mean by that is he improving any of his pieces or his pawn structure by making a capture? If he is, then you have to break the tension. You have to be the one to capture. That's when you should move first. But if the answer is no, then you leave the tension. And if the answer is if he captures and I recapture, I improve my position, you don't capture. So it's 2 against 1. The only time you want to break the tension is when it is going to improve your position. If it keeps the status quo, or if it gives you a better position, hold off. And we'll get a little bit more of a visual clue to that in a moment here. Lev decided to maintain the tension here with knight to f6. Now d5, and Lev at this point decided to break the tension with e takes d5. It's a decent move. It's a push. It is good for both players. But it was possible in this position to not take right away and instead tuck the bishop back. And here you're taking up the position of being the second capturer, or the recapturer, not the capturer. So after d takes e6 here, queen takes e6, you've improved the position of your queen by this trade, and your bishop's opened up at the same time, even though it's made a move to get out of the way of the attack of the pawn. So let's continue with just some random moves here to see what can happen. Knight to b5, rook to d7, bc5, bc5, knight takes a7, and now h5. Okay, now in this line, black is down a pawn, but he's got a pretty good initiative on the king side, which seems to make up for that pawn deficit. I think black has full compensation for the pawn, plus a little more. White's knights are like sitting on the sidelines in disarray. Black's got pretty coordinated forces. So that's just a possibility here between the two choices of what Lev played, breaking the tension, or playing bishop b7, maintaining the tension. Let's continue on with our game. Pawn takes on d5, knight takes, c takes d5, and now bishop to a4. It's to offer a trade of bishops because the queen is skewered to the rook, so queen takes is forced, bishop takes, rook to b1, and bishop e5. Okay, so if we address the pros and cons of what Lev did by breaking the tension, we see that he's managed to improve his bishop. He's also managed to trade off some pieces, which got him out of a more or less cramped position. He got rid of one of White's good pieces, the knight that was on c3, and now he has a bishop versus knight endgame, which is pretty much equal. But that's okay. You want to have at least equal with the ability to play on if needed. That's how you play team matches. So this worked out perfectly for Lev. B takes c5, d takes c5. Okay. Each side has a passed pawn and has a future to look forward to. Queen to c4, queen to f7, a4, rook to d6, rook to d3, rook b to d8, rook b to d1. Life evolves around this d pawn. Now Lev plays g4. Now, I thought rook to h6 was an interesting idea. He did not play this, but it's just an idea to try and force a weakness in white camp. For example, if h3, queen to g6, and hopefully white will be tempted to push the d pawn, because, it's a discovered check. So if this happens, then queen to e6, queen to b5, and we can pick off the pawn. Okay. Realistically, white's got some compensation for the pawn. Black's in a little bit of disarray, but a pawn is a pawn is a pawn. And you give Lev a pawn, and he's good for at least another 50 moves. I had to throw that pun in because last time these two players met, the game was drawn based on the 50-move rule. But you can see here that this is materially ahead for black and worth a good, decent fight. Lev decided to go for g4 instead. That whole line I just showed you was a bit ambiguous. White could do different things, but just to give you an idea. And now g3. Okay, he is weakening his king side a bit. And now h5. And this is daring play. Black's king is becoming pretty much exposed. The question is, will Knappen be able to take advantage of the bare naked king? h4 was played, and I think this is a mistake. Now, Lev played king to h7, but I think that that's a mistake as well. I think that black has some good attacking chances after pawn takes en passant. Black's got some good choices here. However, in the game, he played king to h7, so there is no longer an en passant possible. Now, if you were white, what would your plan be? You have to really figure this out in a long-term strategical battle sense. Pause the video and see if you can come up with what white should develop as a plan here. Go ahead and pause and take a look. Okay, well, the ideal thing for white to do is A, to remain with constant contact on that pawn on d5. You don't want to lose it for nothing, so if the queen wanders off, that pawn's gone. But it would be really nice to get the knight to c4 and maybe the queen to d2 or something like that, or d1. And with the knight on c4, you're going to be pushing the rook on d6 off of that square, which means that later on you can push that pawn, if it's permissible. You can push the pawn to d6 and maybe use the knight then going to e5, pushing the rook off of d7, etc., etc. So that's the idea, is to get the knight to c4 in some manner. And that's exactly what Knappen decides to try and do. Goes knight to d2. Now, mind you, the play is still level here, but black has to see what white is up to and come up with a plan to counter it. One thing that black has to notice right away here is that there is actually a tactical threat. The knight would like to come to c4, but it has another square possible. For example, if it was white's move here, he could play knight to e4. Right, it's threatening the rook on d6, and it's threatening the fork on g5. So, for example, if rook tucks back, then knight to g5 is going to win. And if queen to g7, then knight takes d6 is winning. So, if you take the knight, queen takes with check, queen blocks, and queen takes bishop. White just won a pawn. So, that is the immediate threat, and that's why Lev played his bishop back off of this powerful position on e5. Now, knight to b1, rook to e8, knight to a3, rook to e4, queen to c2. Now Lev plays rook to d7. I thought rook to b4 was a little more enterprising, and we'll come back to that. Played rook to d7. And now I think knight to c4 would be a good move for white. The pawn on d5 is not attacked twice by two rooks by black, so knight to c4 looked playable. Instead he played d6. Now this opened up the square on c4 to be guarded by the black queen on f7 as well. King to g6 was played, a5, and now rook to b4. This is a nice move. It keeps the knight from coming into b5 and to c4. So this creates quite a strategic problem for white. Priya traded on b6, and now rook to d5. Now, this is blocking the black queen from hitting the c4 square, so knight to c4 is becoming a bit more potent now. But Lev has something up his sleeve here. He plays bishop to d4. Alright, the rook on d5 is cut off. Very sharp play. And Priya saw this as well. I'm sure he did, before going into this line. And he plays e4. Very good play. But let's step back. If he decides to take on d4, I think he comes out on the short end of the stick after queen takes d5, dc5, queen takes c5, and we have a full exchange up for black. Yeah, black can probably grind this out to a win. But going back to our game, Priya played e4, which is really the only move to continue on here. But we're going to get a material imbalance after this. Oh, by the way, a couple moves ago when Lev played bishop to g7, I think that's one point that he offered a draw to Priya. Priya declined it, obviously, because they kept playing. Now, I told you before we started this game that Arizona needed wins on both these games. But at the time that the position appeared on the board after bishop to g7, let's just pop back to that real quick. In this position here, D-Pro was looking pretty good in his game. He had the bishop pair, material was equal. He was a little cramped, but he looked like he was going to be able to come out of it. So I'm sure that Lev thought that D-Pro was winning that game. So of course, offering a draw to Knappen at this point, Knappen's not going to take it because board 4 was a toss-up. Let's get back to our current position, where Priya just played the very sharp e4. Lev took on e4. Queen takes e4 is check. King to h6. Rook takes d4, sacking the exchange. And Lev follows it up the right way with rook takes d4. C takes d4 was just not the way to go. Because then you have rook to f5. Now, where does the queen go? If to g6, then you get queen f4 check. King h7. Queen to e5. Rook to g7. The threat is rook takes h5, and then rook to g5. So rook to g7, rook takes h5, king g8, and now d7 is just winning for white. And after queen to g7 instead, that's a little easier. Check, king moves, check, and then rook to g5 wins the exchange of the queen for the rook. So c takes d5 is not good. Rook takes d4 though is just fine for black. Rook takes d4, c d4, queen takes d4. Alright, now the smoke is cleared and white has entered into an endgame of a knight and pawn versus rook. Actually, I don't think white has any winning chances here, but he doesn't need to win. As I explained, if they draw this game or draw the other game, they're going to win the match on a tiebreak. If they win this or win the other game, it's a clear victory. So the pressure's on black to try and force a win out of this. Fortunately, black is the only one in this position that can play for a win. I think theoretically it's probably a draw with correct play, but let's continue on and see what happens here. King to h7, and the reason I say it's probably a draw is the black king is just simply too exposed. If his pawn was back on g6, I'd say black has an easy win. But with the pawn on g4 and h5, different story. Alright, queen to e5 was played by Priya, rook to a7, knight c2, rook a2, d7, queen takes d7, queen takes h5 check, king to g7, and now all white has to do is keep checking. He didn't. He played knight to e3. We'll come back to that. But queen to e5, king f7, queen f4, king to g7, and now it is safe to bring the knight into the game because here he's you'll see why when we go to explain the endgame further. The point is that black can't really get out of the checks, and at the appropriate moment, white's going to be able to play knight takes g4. Going back to our game though, knight to e3 was played. This is a horrible, horrible mistake. And though Knappen had a wonderful season, this has to be his biggest mistake of the season, to play this move. Now, it's black to move and win. Okay, you need to know a little bit about endgames to understand that phrase, black to move and win. Because it's still going to be a long, tough, hard fight, but it is a win. Black to move and win. Pause the video, see what you come up with. Okay, the move to win the game is rook to a5. Beautiful. Gives up the pawn on g4. That is the only place that the white queen can move to. She is checkmated other than that move. So queen takes g4, queen takes g4, knight takes g4, and now Lev plays rook to a1 check. I think that Lev made things a little tougher on himself with the way he proceeded here, but he was getting short of time. It's still winning the way he goes, but I think b5 is just much more straightforward. And let's take a look at this. If knight to e5 here, then we get b4, knight to d3, b3, king f1, rook a2, king e1, b2. He has to give up the knight real quickly here. And this is a win for black, as we will demonstrate further on. And again, after b5, if he tries to bring the king in right away, well, now we got b4, and now if king to e2, b3, king d3, rook b5, getting behind the pawn, king c4, b2 wins. Or from here, knight to e3, b3, knight to d1, rook a2, f3, rook to d2, hitting the knight, knight c3, b2, king e1, rook to c2, and this is a very easy win for black. So I think Lev made things a little tougher by checking on a1, but okay, he's not throwing the win away. I'm sure he's seen this before. I don't play as much chess as Lev does. I've won the rook versus 3 pawns many times, probably about 6-7 times. King g2, there's a technique to it, and we're going to demonstrate it in this game. Alright, so the pawn starts racing, and now b3 is a much more straightforward way to go. Lev plays rook to e1. Let's take a look. Passed pawns are meant to be pushed. So b3, knight to d3, rook to c1 is the key here. Now king to e2, we can play b2. And if he was to go king to e3, well, we can play Rook to c2 anyhow. G4 and b2, same thing. White's going to have to give up the knight for the pawn on b2, and then we'll get into the rook versus 3 pawns. Lev played rook to e1. Again, still doesn't throw the win away, but he makes things a bit tougher. Knight to d3. Looks like this might be saving the game because it's forking the rook and the pawn, but simply b3. And this demonstrates how awkward the knights are in defending pawn endgames, because if knight takes e1, which wasn't played obviously, then b2, and there's no stopping the promotion. Priya played g4 here. And after king h6, king f4, rook to e2, g5, king to g7, king f3, rook to c2, then h5, b2, he has to give up the knight, and king to g3. Okay, now we get to the critical part of the endgame. All that we've seen up to this point is a given. Black is going to be able to maneuver the B or A pawns up the board to force the trade. And it's a little more difficult if it's a C pawn, but the trade can still happen. But here we have a rook versus 3 pawns, and you might think, my God, how do you have a rook stop 3 pawns? Well, if the 3 pawns were on the 6th rank, things are very difficult for Black. But here they are on the 5th rank, and 1 is on the 2nd rank. The point is, when they're on the 5th rank, you have a little bit of zigzwing possibilities going on here, and we'll see that in a little more detail as we proceed. The idea for Black is, as White advances, he wants to keep his king abreast of the pawns. So if he can get his king up on f5 right here, he's in the most prime position of this type of ending. Now, Lev plays king f7, now f3. White wants to advance this pawn up with the brothers, but he cannot allow the rook to come behind the pawns and force them to advance and create weaknesses and holes for the Black king to come into. So king e6, and now f4 is probably the best way to fight off things, but we're not going to go into all these details. I just want to demonstrate how this game is won. Rook to g2 check, king to f4, and now Lev was very short of time, but he doesn't throw the win away with what he does, but the most technically accurate move here is rook to g1. He did not play that, but we'll come back to that point of a tempo burner in a moment. He played rook to h2, king to g4, rook to g2 check, king f4, and rook to g1. There we go. Back on the road again. h6, the pawn advances. Now, we don't rush the king over because it allows the white king to come up one more square. The technically correct move here is a tempo burner, rook to g2. Zugzwing. Now, h7 was played, but real quickly, if king to e4, we can just grab this pawn, king f4, rook h5 is winning. So, Priya played h7, rook to h2 stops that pawn. Now he plays king to g4. He could have tried g6, but this allows king to f6. Remember, keep your king abreast of the pawns and as close as possible. King to g3, rook to h6, and Black's going to win this pretty easily. The pawns are going to start falling. Priya played king to g4. Rook takes pawn on h7, f4, rook h1. Now, Kanapin could have resigned at this point, but he kept on going, hopefully to recreate a swindle he got 2 weeks ago. King e5, keep the king abreast of the pawns. You don't need to be in front of it. You want to force the white king to step away. f6, king to e6. Pretty simple technique. Keep the king abreast of the pawns. King f4. Now, rook to g1 is a good move here, but rook to f1 works, and that's what Lev played. King e4, rook to f5. Finally, the remaining pawns are going to fall. f7 was played, rook takes g6, and rook to g7. And now that it is obvious that he was totally outplayed in the endgame, Kanapin resigned. Lev has been able to score 1.5 points against Kanapin, probably the most spectacular player of the year for the chess league, at least in my opinion. Alright, so with this win, everything's knotted up. It's 1.5 to 1.5. And the outcome of this match hangs on just one game, the game between Brigazzi and Mohandesi on board 3. Let's swing over to that one and take a look. Okay, it's down to the wire. It's do or die, win or go home. Whatever cliche you want. In this game, we have Mohandesi playing white, and he starts out with c4, and Brigazza, playing black, plays knight f6. Now, Brigazza has also been on a tear this year. He is also a young player, and he's playing another veteran, the veteran for Arizona. g3, c6, bishop g2, and d5. Oh goody, finally an opening that I know everything about. Queen c2, d takes c4, knight a3, g6, knight takes c4, bishop g7, knight f3, castles, castles, knight bd7. Okay, I should mention that I don't know anything about this opening. I was lying before. Never trust me. That's a bad mistake. d3, knight to b6, knight a5, knight bd5. Now, in the database that I have, this is a novelty, but that's only of a couple games, and they were much lower rated players. So with Brigazza being a higher rated player in this, you'd have to go with his choice here, knight bd5. Bishop d2 was played, and Sakhin's play is similar to Lev's in that they are both pragmatic, reasonable, and not too daring. Again, playing it close to the vest, keeping an equal or slightly better position in case they're called upon later in the game to press for more. c5 was played, knight c4, b6, a3, bishop to b7, b4, knight to d7, hits the rook on a1, so rook a b1, rook c8. Always try and put your rook on a file across from the enemy queen. Queen to b3, he didn't like that idea. Knight to c7, rook fc1. Both players are playing a cat and moose game here, building up their positions for possible future breaks. Neither player on this board wants to be the first to make a dangerous move. It's still early in the game, still early in the match. Now, b5 looks like a useful move to me, but like I said, he doesn't want to try anything daring at this point, and he plays knight to e6, queen to d1, removes his queen from the action of the queen side so that she's not a target there later on, but he also has another idea behind this. Rook to c7, queen to f1. Right, the idea is if the knight on f3 moves and black captures on g2, white can recapture with the queen. Again, we're talking about the tension ideas and trades, when to make trades. If your opponent does not gain anything by making the trade, you allow him to make the trade. So this would be the case there. Queen to a8, setting up a sort of hedgehog-style defense over here. Bishop e3, rook fc8, b5. All right, a bit of a trade-off here for white. You know, the pawns are nice to get up the board. They cramp black a bit. But, you know, will they become a weakness later on? Knight to d4. And now, I'm very partial to bishops. I would have taken with the knight. So, for example, Mohandesi played bishop takes d4 here. I would have gone for knight takes, pawn takes, and then bishop g5. Yeah, plays pretty level here, though, too. But at least you keep the bishop pair. He plays bishop takes d4, cd4, a4, bishop to d5, a5, trying to get some action going on the queen side. So we're getting some aggressive play by Mohandesi. Rook to c5 and a6. In the last game, we saw Lev Altunian expose his king side, and now we see Mohandesi exposing his queen side. So very balanced play from Arizona on boards 2 and 3 if you combine them together. Now the pawns are very cramping to black's position, but the question is, are they an asset or a liability? Well, that's how the play evolves from here on out. Queen to b8, knight fd2, bishop to h6, bishop takes d5, rook takes d5. Now, I thought f4 was an interesting move here. He didn't play it. He played rook to c2, and now bishop takes d2. Just a quick step back. David Pruitt was recommending rook c to c5 with a 5th rank lateral defense and attacking the pawn on b5. But as we will see, after bishop takes d2, rook takes d2, that's exactly what Brigazzi intended to play. Rook c to c5. Now, rook d to b2, protecting that pawn. Knight to e5. Now, black seems to have worked his way out of a stalled opening and grabbed a foothold in the center here. Black probably stands better here. I don't think it's winning, but at this point, Mac had already drawn his game on board 1, and D-Pro was losing his, and Lev looks like he had a drawish position. So, certainly, if Black could have gone for a draw here, I think that he should have, at least on a team match standing reasoning. Knight to d2 was played, queen to e8, putting more pressure on the pawn on b5, and just how do you defend it? Well, Mohandesi had figured that out already, and he plays queen to g2. Now the pawn is tactically protected. King to g7 was played. Let's take a step back. Why, oh why, can he not take on b5? Well, then you get this. Takes, 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 queen takes, and now queen to a8 check. And this is the point. King to g7, take on a7. Now we're threatening simply queen to b7, a7, a8. So knight to c6, queen to c7. He takes the a pawn, and knight on c6 falls, so just give black some kind of move here, and now knight to c4 is the move. You're going to win the b pawn now. You don't want to play a7 here, because black can defend the knight and stop you from promoting. And the point here is, if you go a8, the queen can recapture, and she's still protecting the knight. So knight to c4 is the nice move here. Queen to b1, king to g2, queen to b5, queen takes b6, and we can see that this is pretty much a winning advantage for white. So that's why back here, Brigazzi didn't bother to try and take the pawn. He knew something was smelling rotten in the state of Denmark. Played king to g7. And now Mohandesi plays queen to e4, queen to d7. The idea is to play queen to h3, knight to g4, and mate in a couple moves. So, to prevent this, he just doesn't allow the queen to come in. He plays king to g2. And now rook takes b5. Sometimes the problem with taking ill-gotten gains is that they are ill-gotten gains. Let's take a step back. Knight to g4 is probably a better idea, and if king to g1 now, then h5, and I think the position is just level here. Well, actually, maybe black's a tiny bit better. But after the move played in the game, rook takes b5, white just trades, and now plays queen takes d4. And the problem is, black can't take the pawn on a6 because the knight on e5 is hanging with check. So first he bolsters that, and now queen to d8. Yeah, it seems amazing that Mohandesi keeps finding a tactical way to keep hanging on to the critical pawns on the queen side. Yeah, he lost the b5 pawn, and if he loses the a6 pawn, it's game over. But he's really got a keen eye to the tactics to hang on to that. Queen to d7 was played, and of course he's not going to want to trade queens, at least not in this type of position. But let's look at what happens if he takes on a6. Well, this is just absolutely horrible. Queen takes e7, knight to f7, otherwise king moves, queen takes f6. It's going to threaten nasty things and the knight on e5. So now knight to e4, queen to a1, protecting the f6 pawn, knight to d6, queen to a2, protecting the knight, knight to e8, king to g8. Well, if he goes to h6, that's going to be even worse. After h4, setting up mating nets, queen to d5 check, f3, knight to e5, queen to g7, king h5, queen takes pawn is mate. So, after knight e8 check, the king really has to go backwards to g8. Knight takes f6 with check, king to g7, and we check again, king to g8, and now knight to c7. Quiet but deadly move. The threat is queen to e8 check and knight to e6, and I don't think black can survive that. So going back to the game, that's why Brigazzi played queen to d7, now queen to b8, knight to c6, and queen to a8, b5, and now f3. Let's take a quick look at why queen to b7 is not the best move. Well, here you would have not the trade of queens, but queen to d5 check, e4, queen takes d3, and if you take the knight, he takes the knight, you take the pawn. Queen to d4 is just going to hold the position just fine for black, get him the draw that he very much needs to advance to the semifinals. Okay, by this time, Dipro had lost his, Mac had drawn his game, but now it was looking like Lev had good winning chances in his game. And this is the position on this game where, in the last game we looked at, the smoke had cleared and we ended up with Lev having a rook versus a knight and a pawn. Yeah, so things look promising for Arizona. So Mohandesi was really looking hard for ways to really keep in this game. So b5 was played, and now f3. b4. That pawn could be a bit of a problem if white's not careful. So he starts to try and bring his king in. Now knight to d4. Queen to b7. Now the trade here would not be good for black. So he plays queen to h3. It's check. King to e1. And now he'd like to take the pawn on h2, but there's not enough time. He plays queen to e6. And he would really like to push b3 himself. Let's take a look at being a pawn grabber, because that's always fun, right? Well, now we have queen takes pawn with check. And now if king to h6, if queen to f8, and if king to h5, we end up mating in such a manner as here. If king to h4, queen h6, king g3, knight f1 check, king g2, and bazinga, mate. Or here, if king to g5, knight e4. Now if king to h4, queen to h6 is mate. So king f4, queen to d6. Uh-oh. King e3, queen takes queen. Not mate, but just as fun. And here, if king to g5, then we have knight e4, king to h5, g4, king h4, queen h6. It's mate. Going back here, instead of going to h6, he tries king to g8. Then we have queen to d8, king g7, queen takes d4, with a very simple win as well. So, though both players were short of time, Brigazzi really had to notice that kind of stuff, and he did. He played queen to e6. This presents white with a little bit of problem on the e2 square, but thankfully e4 does away with any mate threats. Knight to c6 was played to protect the pawn on a7. Knight to c4, making advancing the pawn to b3 a little more shaky, but he tries it anyhow. But it looks a little dangerous to take it, because if queen takes b3, then knight to d4, so threatening knight takes f3 check, and it gets very questionable from that point. So Mohandesi just simply plays king to d2, doesn't bother going in for all that deep calculations. Now I think that Brigazzi's next move is a mistake. He plays queen to h3. He's trying to come in from behind the ranks on white. Now that the pawn's on e4, that's a little more practical, but if we go back, I think knight to e5 was a better shot. And then if king to c3, now if he advances the pawn, we just take it with the knight. So knight takes c4, d takes c4, queen to e5 check, king takes b3, queen c5. White's up a pawn, definitely favorable to white, but it's going to be very difficult to win it. But I think that given enough time, Mohandesi would be able to convert the point. But in the game, queen to h3 was played. Now king to c3, and another bad move. He plays queen takes h2. Again, Pawn grabbing is not the way to go. If your opponent is offering a pawn, you better think long and hard about it. But when you're short on time, you don't have that luxury. Queen to e6 should have been enough to stay in the game. And after something like d4, b2, queen takes b2, white's up a pawn. He's looking good. I'm not sure that I would yet call it winning, but you definitely got to give white the edge and the possibility to press home for the win. But after queen takes h2, it's actually over. King takes b3. I do want to point out that maybe Bogazzo was hoping for a little trap here of queen takes c6. Hey, it's a free knight, right? Not quite. Queen c2 check, king to d4, and b2. The pawn will end up promoting because if the knight takes it, the queen on c6 hangs. But even short of time, Mohandesi doesn't mess with that kind of line. He just plays king takes b3. Black's threat is eliminated. Pawns are equal, but black's in a very bad position now. The queen is out of play on h2, and the knight is no match for the queen and the a-pawn. Knight d4 check was played, king to c3, now knight to e2 check, and king to b4. Look, ma, no more checks. Queen to g1, protecting the h7 pawn, but there's another pawn to be had. Queen takes e7. Now, king to h6 might keep black in the fight a little bit longer, but he plays king to g8. I thought the e5 was an interesting idea here, and it probably is stronger, but with the lack of time the players had, Mohandesi's move of queen takes f6 was just fine. I think that white has a winning advantage here. Queen checks on b1, king c5, queen to g1 check. The king keeps coming forward. Knight to d4 check. King to b7, queen to b1 check. King takes the pawn. So it turns out that the king, not the queen, won that pawn on a7 after all these moves. Queen takes d3. Knight to b6. Knight to b5 check. King to b8. Queen to a3. Queen to d8 check. King g7, and now queen to d7 check is going to pick up the knight on b5. King moves, queen takes knight, queen d6 check, king to b7. And it's beyond all hope at this point. Brigadzé resigned, and Arizona moves on to the semifinals. A tough break for St. Louis. These two guys on boards 2 and 3 just had a tremendous season. My hat is off to them. Very impressive. But the older guys, the veterans for Arizona, were the deciding factor in this quarterfinals playoff. All right, folks. There were some interesting games, and I encourage you to go to the USChessLeague.com, and you can review the games in their PGN viewer. Look at the games from the Dallas versus Seattle match. Very interesting, especially the one that Akopian lost. Very interesting game. Maybe sometime in the future I'll analyze that one because that looked like a fun one to take a look at. But Arizona advances. Next, they will go on to face the Seattle Sluggers. And that is going to be a tough, tough matchup. But interesting thing is, Seattle was the 4th seed, Arizona was the 3rd seed. The two underdogs in the West advance. And since Arizona was the 3rd seed, Arizona gets the draw odds. So if Arizona ties the match 2-2, or if they win 2.5 to 1.5 or more, Arizona moves on. So the pressure's really on Seattle to score 2.5 in this matchup on Monday. And if Mac is feeling better, hopefully someone was able to sing Soft Kitty to him and get him relaxed and in a good mood for the next game. Hopefully Mac will be able to score a point there. And that, if he does that, it's all over. If he loses, it's going to be a close match. If he draws against Akopian, I think Arizona still has good chances then. I think Seattle's hoping for Akopian to win, but they were hoping for him to win against Dallas. Fortunately, the other boards pulled through for Seattle to have Seattle advance to the semifinals. All right, folks, that's it for the Western Division quarterfinals of Arizona versus St. Louis. Arizona advances on. Until next time. Oh, by the way, tune in to ICC or chess.com on Monday, and they will have the playoffs there, the semis. Until next time. Good luck.